Greetings everyone, Rambling Collector here, and today this marks the first video of the Halloween 2022 reviews. For this video will be particularly special. It will be our first book versus book video, starring Stephanie Meyer's Twilight and Death to the Soul by R.I. Polsgrove. Let's get started, shall we? So to start off with, my friend River, the author of Death to the Soul, has been requesting this one in particular for quite a while, and I figured what would be the better time than during the good old time of Hallows Eve, and better yet, to make it the first video of my Halloween 2022 reviews. So, a while back I was actually challenged to read Stephanie Meyer's Twilight after reading Death to the Soul, and to be honest, I found Twilight lacking severely, but this video itself has been requested quite heavily, and so I thought, why not? Let's break this down both with our two main characters, our main couple, as well as the main plot of the story, shall we? So to start off with, I'm going to rip the band-aid off immediately and say this. I am not the biggest Twilight fan. I honestly think it is not a good vampire story, and it most certainly does not give off a good romance story. But let's go ahead and talk about this more in depth. So, our plot for this story, if you don't already know, is about a young woman named Belle, who is sent off to Forks, Washington, to live with her father, while her mother, with her new boyfriend, who is a baseball player, is looking for a new home somewhere down in Florida. Meanwhile, Bella does not have very many fond memories of Forks, Washington, but she goes there to give her mother a bit of space, and mostly because she views this as a sort of self-sacrificing motif to make her mother happy, which in all honesty does not make a lot of sense to me. But, to continue. So Bella arrives in Forks, tries to get used to it, gets a new truck from her dad, Charlie, and then proceeds to go to high school. And she is definitely the most popular kid there because she's essentially from out of town. And a lot of people are interested to get to know her. But the one person that attracts her attention is the pretty boy of the school, Edward Cullen, whom at first does not give off the best of vibes, giving her the most pissed off look ever, like she had essentially just kicked his puppy. But over time, we see how she feels an attraction to Edward, like she cannot get him out of her mind, but eventually she does get the chance to get to know Edward, as well as who he is, a vampire. And not only that, but his entire family, the Cullens, are not only some of the richest folks in all of the town of Forks, but they are all vampires. She comes to figure this out, and has to juggle her feelings with a man who is essentially a danger to her very life, and yet she cannot help the way she feels. She feels attracted to him. She cannot get him out of her head. And I'm just standing here like, okay, that's fine. Young teen romance, that's good. But throughout all of this, as I was reading Twilight, I could not help but feel bored. The only reason I even picked up Twilight in the first place was because I was challenged to read it by River, and in order to give my thoughts on it. And what was my final thoughts after reading it? A near 500-page book about young teen romance with vampires thrown in. Not the greatest, to be quite honest with you. Now on the flip side, let's talk about Death to the Soul, the first book of the Dead Soul series by R.I. Polsgrove, also known as River Isabel Polsgrove. And honestly, you guys, I had my reservations at first about reading this one, especially when I heard it was a vampire romance, because at first I thought it was going to be similar to Twilight, as well as the other more popular vampire romance series, known as Bite Me. But no, Death to the Soul stands out by itself as a literary work of art, in my opinion. Especially considering River themselves is a independent author. So, our story here does not have a happy start. It shows Rianne going off to her mother's funeral after writing a letter to her mother, whom we come to find out was not the greatest of parents, nor exactly was the rest of Rianne's extended family. So she goes off to the mother's funeral, despite not wanting to go whatsoever, because of the fact that she has major issues with her family, and she does not want to be near any of them because they were just as bad as her mother. And to be honest, I do not blame her. Over the course of this, she gets into a car crash with a drunk driver, followed by Quinn just happily running into her. I know, that kind of seems weird to have Quinn just pop up out of nowhere, but he notices the situation that she's in and offers to help her. He even offers to drive her to the funeral, where he comes to see the family situation that Rianne is in. Over the course of this, we see that Quinn himself does struggle with the hunger, like Edward does with Bella. However, unlike Edward, who is constantly suffering for himself because he tries to plead vegan, Quinn, essentially he does embrace his vampiric nature, but him himself not being a full vampire, which I will explain further in my character versus character part of this video. But over the course of this, we see how Rianne struggles through her life as a victim of abuse from a priest, a school teacher, her own mother, and even the rest of her extended family, and even her boss. She just has abuse after abuse heaped onto her, and Quinn just running around finding out about his quote-unquote next meal. Essentially, he comes to find out that her life is not the greatest, and in fact, it actually makes him reflect on his own past of abuse. And quite frankly, let's just say neither Quinn nor Rianne had the best childhoods. Let's put it that way. Not only this, but one of the biggest strengths of Death to the Soul wasn't just the fact that it tackled a lot of heavy subjects, such as child abuse, as well as just, in general, bad parenting and even rape victims. But this also makes all the characters here feel human. Whilst I was reading Twilight, I didn't feel that humanity there. Just the casual conversations of people just talking. It all felt forced. It all felt like all these vampires were otherworldly. But a lot of our vampiric characters here feel human. Like we see them interact, we see them having fun, we see them just doing normal things that humans would normally do. So just going on dates, or even just enjoying a good game or a TV show or something. It makes these characters feel human, despite the fact that in this world you have zombies, werewolves, vampires, and even veyors. Vampires who have been bitten by a werewolf, and essentially now are a stronger breed of vampire, I want to say. But all in all, the way they blend all these supernatural characters into modern society feels more fluid in a way. It feels natural. There's that great chemistry there between all these great characters, and this is accomplished in half of the page number that Twilight has, in just 214 pages. I was hooked throughout the entire thing. There was good action, there was great character drama, there was good romance building up throughout all of this. The plot itself talks about a budding romance with fellow abuse victims growing closer and finding solace with each other. And I think that is honestly a wholesome thing to show. Them learning to overcome this abuse, and in some cases even get a bit of payback. All in all, I felt like Death to the Soul felt more natural than Twilight did, more human. So, let's move on to characters versus characters. Now, let's move on to our segment of character versus character, with the first being our main two guys, of Edward Cullen from Twilight and Quinn from Death to the Soul. Now, to start off, the only similarities that I can think of when I look at these two is that they have this sort of vampiric bad boy look to them. That's all they have in common, though. Primarily for the fact that, for one, Quinn himself, the biggest difference between him and Edward, is that Quinn himself is known as a veyor. a vampire that has been bitten by a werewolf, and as such having a unique set of abilities. Whereas Edward here, he's a full-fledged vampire, although he's also a vegan vampire, which, honestly, that whole idea is completely left field, and honestly not one of the greatest that I can think of. He essentially sustains himself via animal blood. Quinn, on the other hand, embraces his vampiric nature, and simply looks at humanity as food. He actually enjoys the thrill of the hunt of tracking down humans, and essentially taking the blood of his victims. And at first, he does not have this moral code of thinking of them as fellow humans. He thinks of them as just food, at least until near the end of book 1, where Rian sort of turns his mindset around, and it makes him come to terms with the fact that he has literally been killing innocent people this whole entire time, and essentially pulling a whole come to Jesus moment, which I thought was hilarious. But overall, let's put it in another perspective here. Their backstories, for one, are very different. With Edward here, he actually became a vampire after both of his biological parents had died during the whole polio pandemic. And Carlisle, his primogenitor as a vampire, found Edward pretty much on the verge of death and converted him. And from how it's described, it is incredibly painful to turn into a vampire. It's like acid through your blood. However, Carlisle only turned Edward when Edward was on the brink of death. Quinn's backstory, on the other hand, is far darker, and if you are interested to learn the full in-depth story of that, I'd recommend checking out the prequel novel of Quinn. But to give the Cliff Notes version, Quinn's childhood was not the happiest one. He, like Rian, had to endure an abusive family, with his only remaining relative that he actually had a bond with was his younger brother, whom he lost due to the sexual predations of a priest, whom was also a teacher, like Rian. So already we see that Quinn has a very close backstory to Rian, only his story did not have a happy ending. And in the end, when he was turned into a vampire, it was actually by complete accident from a side character of this story, known as Cora, whom herself actually has her own short story. Also, would recommend that one. But essentially, both Edward and Quinn are two very different characters, with Edward essentially living the high life amongst a vampiric family of the Cullens, whilst also living a rather lavish, if isolated, lifestyle. Now, to be honest, I feel like Edward really pulls out more of the rich boy than he does the vampiric bad boy. As for Quinn, he does come from a rich family. In fact, he is known as Quentin Hallward, but he really prefers to just be called Quinn. He wants to separate himself from that lifestyle. And I really like how, unlike Edward, who lives in the modern day, Quinn sort of has this Middle Ages idea. He does have a television, but he mostly watches essentially sitcoms or nature documentaries. But one of his biggest games that he likes to play is, of course, chess. So these characters are drastically different. One despises himself for his vampiric nature, whilst the other embraces it. But also in the end, let's talk about their interactions with the main heroines of their stories. With Edward, he gives off this very creepy, almost stalkerish vibe whenever he follows Bella around. He essentially even tells her straight up, "I like watching you sleep." And even in the movie, he comes off a little bit aggressive, where he does this thing where he confronts Bella in the middle of the forest after she realizes what he is. Unlike in the book, where it's actually in a car ride, where they seem to just casually dance around the subject, without her essentially saying, "You're a vampire," and him just demanding that she just say it, like he does in the movie. As for Quinn, how Rian finds out is very different, but I will talk about more of that in a bit. But the way she finds out is one day when she's just relaxing at his home and just mistakenly finds out after wandering around. And it is a surprise to her, but she gradually comes to accept it. But now, as for Quinn, I do like that more sadistic nature to him. Like, he doesn't hide who he is. And if anything, he's not ashamed of who he is. But let's talk about the main heroines here. Now, as for our main heroines here of Bella versus Rianne. In all honesty, you guys, Bella's character is not one that I like whatsoever. If anything, she comes across as a brat, in a way. Like, I get this entire vibe of being a brat. Like, she supposedly moves to Forks, Washington to allow her mother to live with her boyfriend. But she knows that she hates Forks, which, if you want to give her brownie points, they're saying, well, it's a self-sacrificing moment. No, it's just kind of stupid. But then after that, she just tries to adapt to Forks, tries to interact with her classmates, and the way she comes off is very bratty in a way, like very off-putting. Like, she constantly downgrades a lot of the boys there, like looking at them, just like thinking, they're not so special. They're kind of idiots. Or, God, these are so annoying. You know, the whole high school drama thing. Rianne's character, on the other hand, she is, like Quinn, a victim of abuse. And in fact, it literally opens up the book of Death to the Soul with a letter that she wrote to her now deceased mother, essentially calling her mother out on her abusive behavior. How she was never a mother to Rianne, and that essentially she does not want to interact with her family whatsoever. She wants nothing to do with them due to their actions against her. And we constantly see Rianne struggling with the same abusive behavior from her family, some of her friends, and even from her boss at work, who is constantly trying to harass her, like sexually as well as verbally. Even her friends kind of give her this thing of, well, your mom did try to raise you, and none of them know the full story of Rianne's history with her mother, the sheer abuse that Rianne went through. So unlike Bella, who has this sort of bratty attitude of a high schooler, Rianne is already a fully fledged adult by this point, which makes her, in my opinion, a bit more relatable. Not only that, but Bella pulls off this whole damsel in distress act. Like, at one point, she gets chased down by a gang of people who look like they're trying to have their way with her. And of course, Edward comes in like the knight in shining armor. Great. Whereas Rianne, we see her sticking up for herself. How she essentially calls out her friends, tells them, hey, I think it's time for you to leave. She leaves her boss after one too many times of just crappy attitude. But more importantly, a bit of a minor spoiler here, when she gets the chance for payback against one of her old tormentors, she takes it, and in my opinion, she enjoys it, which I found immensely satisfying. Bella, on the other hand, gets in trouble and essentially has this whole vampiric support group looking out for her. She does not have a chance to actually stick out for herself as a character, which again harkers back to the damsel in distress trope, which I find very annoying. To put it simply, it really downgrades what might be a good female character, but Bella, no, she just gives off that whole, like, that's her whole character. And in fact, the relationship with her parents, unlike Rianne, who wants nothing to do with them, Bella acts like she wants to be close to her mother, but really, she's very distant with both of them in a way, especially her dad, Charlie. Like, she openly calls her father, in her thoughts, Charlie, which kind of amounts to a bit of disrespect in my opinion. But again, Rianne, when both of them find out that the boys that they like are vampires, they both take it in very different ways. Bella kind of dances around it, essentially kind of calls Edward out on it, in a way. But as for Rianne, she finds out, and she responds in the appropriate way of running away from this possible mass serial killer who might be trying to suck her blood. Bella, on the other hand, is just like, oh, you're a vampire. Cool, I like you even more now. Where is your survival instinct, woman? Rianne actually has survival instinct. You do not. What the hell? Anyways, so let's talk about the side characters here. So, let's now move on to the main side characters of both stories. Let's compare them both. We have Carlisle, Alice, and Rosalie from Twilight, and Lucas and Natalie from Death to the Soul. Now, I will say these actually contain two of the actual likable characters for me, them being Alice and, surprisingly enough, Carlisle. Rosalie, however, is not that significant of a side character, except for her attitude towards Bella. Rosalie has this sort of competitive nature for Bella, considering the fact that Rosalie and Edward were supposed to be engaged as vampiric mates to each other, but with Bella now in the picture, that is no longer an option. Whereas for Alice, Alice is a unique vampire in the fact that she was not created by Carlisle, but was in fact adopted into the Cullen family after another vampire seemingly just left her for dead, and she was found wandering around in the woods aimlessly. Alice is one of the few likable characters because she has this sort of younger sister vibe to her. Like, she has the excitable child nature to her. And essentially she forces Bella to try dresses despite the fact that Bella does not like to do this stuff. But also Alice has a unique precognitive or future sight ability, which is actually pretty unique for a vampire style. Now, as for Carlisle, I'm very confused with his character in a way. He is like the main father figure of the Cullen family. He works as a doctor, helps out in Forks, which is very, very nice. But all in all, I can't help but feel a little bit confused with his motives. He essentially wants to preach the way of life of essentially honoring human souls, as well as just never partaking of human blood. Essentially, they try to keep them as a whole as vegan vampires, where they just feast on animal blood rather than human blood, like the rest of their kind do. Now, Carlisle's main, I want to say, motivation from this is the fact that he is also Mormon, aka Christian. He's a Mormon Christian and wants to spread that belief, or the inspiration from it, to the rest of his kindred, the rest of his clan. I do admit he does take the right steps in at least protecting Bella, whilst also kind of putting him and his family at risk by protecting her from another group of vampires that pops up, whom are all human hunters. I will admit, like I said again, Carlisle is a confusing character for me, at the very least. Rosalie, absolutely despise her because of the fact that she has this entitled rich girl attitude, as well as the hatred for Bella simply because she, in her mind, stole her designated partner or designated mate. Alice is another likable character here, but that's about it, honestly. Now, let's focus on Lucas and Natalie from Death to the Soul. One thing I will say Rivers' writing does is that not only does she make very compelling and human main characters with Quinn and Rianne, but also with Lucas and Natalie. Lucas is the second vampire introduced in Death to the Soul, whereas Natalie is actually, surprisingly enough, a zombie, which is something I never thought I'd see that much, which is interactions between other supernatural beings within the modern day world. Now, what I like about Lucas and Natalie is that Lucas himself is another vampire, and he's full-on proud of it. But he also has some human characteristics, like he loves to take photos, he loves to hang out with Quinn. And initially, he is by far fully against having Rianne near Quinn. He keeps on egging Quinn on to just feed on Rianne already and just get it over with. Just feast on her, and he keeps on wondering what is Quinn's fascination with Rianne. He doesn't understand it, and is full-heartedly against it. At least until further in the book. I will not spoil what happens further on, but you'll just have to find out for yourself. Now, as for Natalie, Natalie's character is actually pretty interesting, especially for a zombie. As a matter of fact, they actually made the transition from male to female after becoming a zombie. And I will admit, zombies in River's world essentially have it where they use heavy cosmetic surgery to keep themselves looking alive, despite the fact that they're decaying bodies, which I found fascinating. It shows how zombies sort of disguise themselves by using these heavy cosmetic treatments to make themselves look alive, and not to mention, they also feast on brains. But how do they do this? They work in funeral homes, they work in crypts, things of that nature. They work in things that involve dead people, because nobody's going to notice the corpse is missing a brain, right? Or nobody's going to notice this corpse is missing a few bags of blood. Again, that's genius, and it incorporates a way for zombies and vampires to get their food source without attracting too much attention from either the local authorities or the rest of the human population. Whereas the Cullens, on the other hand, give off this vibe of being loners, as well as being mysterious, which attracts attention to them from the local populace of Forks. And whilst usually they just stand away from it, Carlisle does this as well by doing the whole doctor thing, as Dr. Cullen. He interacts with human society, at the very least. The rest of the Cullen family, not so much, and thus it draws more of a mysterious air around them, which draws unnecessary attention. Lucas and Natalie you could probably see walking down the street and you wouldn't know a freaking difference. Now, I do like how Lucas is just openly going about his business. He does not care for humans, views them the same as Quinn does at the start of the book, views them as food, which likely will not change overnight. But he actually grows to make these human companionships. Initially, he's very against humans until he meets Rianne and actually gets to know her a bit. And again, there is some major character surprises for both of them concerning Lucas and Rianne, but I will not spoil that. But one thing I will say about River's story is that it is not focused wholly on Quinn and Rianne. In fact, we actually do see a nice little side romance between Lucas and Natalie in their growing relationship with each other. Two monsters just falling in love. Isn't that just wholesome? And to be honest with you, it adds more depth because it's not focused solely on, well, Quinn and Rianne. We actually get some character development for the side characters. Carlisle, Alice, and Rosalie, not so much. We only know them through Bella's eyes. We don't see them outside of Bella's interactions with them. We don't get to see much of what else they do, which definitely downgrades them as just side characters. It doesn't make them stand out as much. With all that being said, on the subject of the romance, now then, let's talk about the romance between our main couples of Quinn and Rianne and Edward and Bella. To be honest, you guys, there really is no competition about which one is better, but let me go ahead and highlight some main points here. First of all, the romance between Edward and Bella, compared to Quinn and Rianne, feels far more uncomfortable, if I might add. Because for one thing, Edward presents himself as far older. Like, he has this aura about him that dictates that he is far older than he really is. He looks young, he looks like a teenager, but he has the mindset of a much older man. And that, honestly, just is very uncomfortable to think about, especially considering how old Bella is in the books. And to be honest, it sends off a very creepy, stalkerish vibe, considering the fact that, for one, as I mentioned before when I was talking about Quinn versus Edward, Edward watches Bella while she sleeps, which, if that does not send creepier vibes, and the fact is, Bella actually says she doesn't mind this, as a matter of fact. Like, she is not completely creeped out by this. She's not like, dude, how long have you been stalking me? Not only this, but the sheer coincidence of her continuously running into him. No, there is no coincidence here. It's literally like he is following her. Hell, at one point, he literally goes off to Alaska to get away from her in order to get his head on straight. And then after that, he just continuously pursues her, despite the fact that he has literally kept telling Bella, you should stay away from me for your own safety. Despite this, Bella continues to ignore these warnings and continuously go after him. And in fact, Edward himself actually seems to ignore his own advice to her, and does not keep his distance whatsoever. Now, another thing is, Bella, once again, He seems to be ignoring all red flags, saying, hey, this is a dangerous predator. Maybe I should stay away for my own safety. This guy is far older than me. Isn't this just a little bit creepy? But no, she finds him watching her while she sleeps charming. Don't know where the hell you find that charming at all. That's just plain creepy. Not only that, but despite the fact of knowing A, he is a vampire, her survival instincts once again seem to be non-existent. Not only this, but she also depends on Edward a lot. It's like she cannot be her own character. She cannot stand on her own without Edward right there being an emotional support crutch. And honestly, you guys, here's a fun fact for you. There's actually a gender-swapped version of the first book of Twilight called Life and Death, done by Stephanie Meyer, and it actually wraps up the whole story of Twilight in a single book. Because at one point, Bella actually gets bitten by another vampire and is in the process of turning, right? Edward sucks the poison right out of her. And at one point, when she talks to him about possibly being turned as a vampire for good to stay with him, he continuously tells her, hey, you don't want this. Despite the fact that Bella continuously says, yes, actually, I do. I want to stay with you forever. Whereas in the book, Life and Death, when the roles are reversed, like when the genders are swapped, literally, the male version of Bella, Buford Swan, becomes a vampire, and then they just live happily ever after together. It's like, after 4 consecutive books, watching these two go back and forth, and literally it could have been wrapped up in just one single novel. Now, as for Quinn and Rianne, one of the things that really sticks out to me more than Edward and Bella, and what actually makes me enjoy the romance more, is that despite the fact that Quinn is definitely far older than Rianne, like statistically he is far older. I mean, he was around her in the Middle Ages, but anyways, the point being, it feels like there's not this boundary between the two. Like, Quinn acts the age of around, let's say, 18. He acts like this. He has this mental fortitude, like he is far older, but he just doesn't act like it. He acts like he would be if he were physically the age he is. And to be honest with you, another thing that also really adds more chemistry to Quinn and Rianne is that they act more human. They have human faults with them. And there is this natural chemistry between the two because they both come from bad situations, and by sticking around together, they actually grow closer to each other because of this abuse that they have suffered, and they wind up being the emotional support for each other. It isn't just one partner essentially overpowering the other, like what happens with Edward and Bella. Like, Bella describes it as she cannot think with Edward, like she feels overpowered by him, but she likes it. She doesn't fight him as much. Whereas Rianne, the one thing with Quinn that he does not want to lose is lose Rianne. Like, he could control her, he could dominate her, but in the process he would have killed Rianne's individuality, and he does not want that. He does not want to control Rianne. He understands that Rianne is her own person, and essentially allows it to be an equal partnership. It is not just one partner dominating the other. And to be honest with you, I love how at one point Quinn actually gives Rianne the chance for revenge, and that way she can actually stick up for herself. Like, she takes revenge for herself. Like, he gives her that opportunity. Whereas with Bella, once again, the damsel in distress, with Edward as the shining knight. Not very balanced for a romance, if I might add. And to be honest, again, there is the whole human characteristics. Like, at first, Quinn openly admits that he wants to essentially feed off of Rianne, right? He struggles with this throughout the entire book, but he cannot help but feel like he's growing closer to her. He cannot view her simply as food. He views her as a person. Edward, on the other hand, he consistently has to struggle with this, with negating his bloodlust from Bella, despite the fact that all of his hunter's instincts are literally stating, hey, eat this woman. Eat her. She's right in front of you. Do it. Do it. But with Quinn and Rianne, I like how there's actually a loophole because of the fact that Quinn is a Veyor. he actually has this ability to suck out a little piece of Rianne's soul, and thus it allows him to satisfy that hunger for her, and thus makes for a much more balanced relationship and removes that sort of tension of whether he will or will not feed off of her. And again, you see where this is going here, don't you? There is a lot of problems I have with Twilight, and a lot of good that comes with Death to the Soul. So I think it is very obvious who the winner between these two books will be. So in conclusion, I will have to say that when it comes between these two books, Death to the Soul, in my opinion, is the obvious winner. Because throughout all of this, despite the fact that Twilight has a greater page amount and is more widely known than Death to the Soul, I would conclude that in terms of story and character involvement and even in romance, Death to the Soul is the superior novel and is one that I would highly recommend for this Halloween season, especially if you're in the mood for a new vampire romance. And also it would definitely help to support the author, R.I. Polsgrove, quite a bit to spread their story. And in the end, Twilight, I feel like, is not a bad book, just not for me. And if you like it, that is entirely up to you. But, from my perspective, Death to the Soul is the clear and obvious winner. With all that being said, thank you all for sticking around for the first of the Halloween 2022 reviews. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. And if you're interested in more, feel free to stay tuned for any future videos for this Halloween.